a key ingredient in fertilisers. Why? Well, much the same as why China might want to buy farms here, shoring up the supply chain. We know that there's going to be increasing demand for food products, right? So that's just going to keep going up and up. We need fertilisers, and so for an export-oriented company like BHP Billiton, they know how to mine, they know how to sell things. It seems like a natural horizontal move for them, and they just see this resource sector as a key element of growth in the future as agricultural demand continues to rise.
Yeah, and the Canadians have been very clever, because since I think the 1940s there have only been 10 potash mines on these enormous reserves. So they're not going to be giving the stuff away. What's it going to mean to fertilizer costs for farmers here, Stuart?
We shouldn't overstate the likely increases in fertiliser prices here. We've had a lot of volatility, but we're a very small user of fertiliser in the world stage. And I think the biggest problem we have is how to get fertiliser into New Zealand on small ships in small lots with two major people, Balance and Ravensdown. Do we really need two main companies operating here, cooperatives, members in both? It seems to me we've got some real distribution supply chain issues in how we deal with fertiliser here. We've got old plants around the place. Heaven knows how they continue to get resource consent. And so, I think the costs of fertiliser in New Zealand are much more likely to be driven by shipping costs because of where the shipping lines want to be. So we're backloading out of Australia, and the distribution, grinding sort of plants we've got in New Zealand are going to continue to add costs. So some real rationalisation possibilities available.
From fertiliser to the red meat sector, we've just seen the government and private companies pump a lot of money now. They say that this is the last-ditch effort to bring it back to life. But it seems to me that they've really been wildly optimistic about what they can achieve with not very much money. What's your take on it, Chris?
I think there's within the industry, there's two issues. One is some of the structural issues that are there, and the other is the actual market issues, and they're different for different products. I think, for example, with lamb, one of the issues, having just travelled around Japan for quite a while, is that it's not top of the radar for them, and the same can go in other Asian economies, in contrast with dairy products, which there's strong demand for. So the risk I always think is that people think, oh, well, if we can make a Fonterra, then we can do exactly the same thing for lamb or for beef, and I just don't think it's that simple. There's issues about the markets and the customer choices, as well as the supply chain here, that need to be addressed.
Stuart, what's your take on the red meat industry?
I agree with Chris, because dairy I think was different. We had a marketing board which we brought into Fonterra. It was used to supplying to consumers, that knew what it was trying to do. Zespri set up for that specific purpose. What is it? A sheep in Hoggett's clothing or something like that. I mean, can we transform some companies that have been excellent at not creating wealth over the last decade into something really new?
And I want to know, and I want to know how come it's taken the government so long to get involved. I mean, it helped out with Fonterra, for example, for Zespri, and yet this sector seems to have limped along. Is it too little, too late? Are we throwing good money after bad? Chris?
I guess as a macroeconomist, there's a lot of details in there which I don't know about. The big picture I see is that the Western world wants to eat beef. And not lamb, and so I think that's a real issue, and there's issues with how we present it as well. When you look at how they want to eat food up in wealthy Asian economies, it's not a piece of lamb shoulder glad wrapped up and chucked into the freezer. We've talked about it for a very long time about the need to add value and present products in the way that they want to eat them, and we do need to do that, but we've seemed to have talked about it for a very long time. So I'll cynically wait and see whether we actually make any changes this time. But having seen, New Zealand products sitting in freezers and pretty ugly packaging on my recent trips abroad, it's a little bit disappointing that we're still thinking about some of these same issues about how to interact with the clients.
Well, we'll see what happens, gentlemen. Thank you. Coming up, we ask, will the taxpayers have to take the fall and stump up money now that Allied Nationwide Finance has been put into receivership? And just how popular is New Zealand for all those immigrants looking for a new home? But first, answer this, because as farmers, you know better than anyone else how those climactic acts of God can play havoc with your livelihood. The question, what is the devastating cost of Pakistan's floods on its major crops and livestock? The answer right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, what is the devastating cost of Pakistan's floods on its major crops and livestock? The answer, $5 billion US. Closer to home, Allied Nationwide Finance, the subsidiary of Allied Farmers, has now been placed into receivership. Chris, what's it going to mean for the taxpayers?
Well, in the first instance, all of these finance companies that are in difficulty that have got the Crown guarantee, it provides some comfort for the investors in those products. But at a bigger picture, it's really just capturing the difficulties for that non-bank financial sector, and some of the troubles with the underlying assets that are in those types of funds that are largely property related. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs in those areas, and it's going to be tough for quite a while, I think.
And ultimately, Stuart, it's people like you and I who, are going to have to pay for the mistakes of the guys running these companies. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think you're right. That in the Allied Nationwide, they're talking about 137 million. Now, it's not the whole 137 million that's going to be lost that the Crown's going to have to come up with. It's going to be some portion of that. I guess my reservations about this is that the government has extended this protection scheme, and then there's the danger, as I see it. Well, how do these finance companies behave? If you're protected, do you take additional risks? What economists call moral hazard. And so, unless you're putting in place a regime to sort of monitor and look at what the finance companies are doing against your guarantee, I think that we're just not doing a great service.
Stuart, knowing that they're going to be bailed out, where is the incentive for the directors of those companies to really do the business?
Well, I think most of them probably behave in a fairly honourable sort of way, but the fact that they got into trouble indicates that they've made some bad decisions. Are we capable of fixing this? Is the skill sets there? Are the directors up to it? Are the directors qualified in these sorts of companies? And those are, reservations I've expressed before, that when I look at the failed finance companies, I found 14% of them were members of the Institute of Directors. So 86% of them weren't members of a professional body, weren't bound by any professional rules, weren't encouraged to engage in continuing professional development. Pretty sad state of affairs.
Okay, Chris, did the government simply panic and just throw money at this problem when the finance companies started to go to the wall?
Well, I think you've got to cast your mind back to the pandemonium that was taking place in the global financial crisis, and at the time it happened very, very quickly when governments around the world started to put into guarantees to their finance sector, because no one was lending to anyone. Banks wouldn't lend to banks, let alone investors lending into finance companies. And so it was really a Sunday afternoon solution almost, you could say, with Australia and New Zealand having to quickly move to put guarantees in place in response to the similar sorts of guarantees taking place offshore. It's worth also mentioning that other financial institutions, including the big banks, have paid levies along the way, so it's actually them that's supporting the bailouts, if you like, now. So banks, I think, can be a little bit grumpy about the fact that they had to pay pretty big levies and were reasonably unlikely and haven't had problems, whereas some of the finance companies were a train wreck waiting to happen. Now, the underlying problem is if you're heavily invested in property, and property's been going up by 20% per annum, you can make a whole lot of pretty bad mistakes and run your finance company pretty poorly. But as long as that property's frothing away, you probably don't have too many problems. But when it stopped, it was like a game of musical chairs. But the guarantee was there and saved a few companies. But you know, a lot of people were saying that there were troubles in that sector long before the global financial crisis, and you know, the chickens really came home to roost.
And despite that, I'll tell you, other people who want to come home to roost, apparently New Zealand, Stuart, is the second most popular country in the world for immigrants to flock to. That's a bit of bright news, isn't it?
Yeah, I think most of them have understand that Waikato University is the leading institution. They want to send their children there. So, yeah, I can understand that.
Thank you, gentlemen. Around the world in the back 40 in 30 minutes. Thanks to my guests, ASB economist Chris Tennent-Brown and Stuart Locke from Waikato University's Finance Department at the School of Management. We'd love to hear your feedback, so drop me a line on our website. Remember to check out my weekly blog. And for all of you Hanover investors out there, we'll give the last word to Eric Watson, who apparently is moving from cool clothes to cows. He dumped his involvement with LA clothing company American Apparel, which is now facing bankruptcy and debts of $170 million, and has decided to go all country instead, concentrating on dairy farming in the U.S. He's cashing in on using clever Kiwi farming practices to help American farmers cut costs on their farms and also put more dollars in his designer pockets. Eric, always glad to help. And by the way, aren't all your Hanover investors proud too? Keep the faith. See you next week.